Next speaker will be sharing with us how 5 dynamics can be applied in creative environments to foster creativity and human-centered design in small teams to support corporate innovation in technology and healthcare. She currently serves as the Global Head of Strategy for Personalized Medicine at Genentech Roche. In this role, she brings together creative leadership with decision-making and long-term futures thinking. Previously, she spent almost a decade at the design and innovation firm IDEO. The first chapter of her career was an early employee building Google's operations in Europe. She's an active advisor in the future of work and talent network space, and occasionally guest lectures on topics related to her experience and interest. I have no doubt that this is going to be a lively and engaging conversation. So please join me in welcoming Susan O'Malley.
Thank you so much, Karen, and it's great to be among partners and collaborators and friends. And I've been logged on all morning and already been thinking about how I can evolve my practice. So just want to say that I'm super excited to be here. This opening slide is something that many of you may know. It's called the design squiggle, and we'll talk about it a bit later on. But the reason I've chosen to lead with this front and center is that I think it's one of the best visual representations I've ever seen of a creative process, be that in the work environment or in a more personal artistic capacity. So as we dive in, I want to just say thank you. And Brian, even the very first speaker this morning, hit on this in his opening comments. You know, this product and tool has helped me tremendously during the 20 years that I've been at work. And we're going to talk about human-centered design, innovation, all kinds of highfalutin, you know, very sort of big picture organizational stuff going on in the world today. But I really wanted to start on a personal level because this tool has helped me so much understanding not just my own natural energy cycles and pathways, but also how it impacts other people. And the best way that I could bring this point to life for you, I think, is by referencing this individual. Not sure if anyone recognizes him. He comes from near the part of the world where I grew up. It's Mr. Charles Dickens. And this is a quote of his that I've really had as a favorite insight ever since I was a small child, which is, he says, an idea, like a ghost, must be spoken to a little before it will explain itself. And I saw this a long time ago. And more recently, when I first took 5 Dynamics, probably 8-10 years ago as an employee at IDEO, it really reminded me that while I have an abundance of exploration energy, explore, creating ideas all day, actually some of the really good stuff happens when I pause and step back and think about how my energy profile intersects with it. So that approach of listening to a ghost, understanding it and taming it to really bring out the best in an idea. So I wanted to give us a little bit of a grounding by talking about the title of this talk, so 5 dynamics in a creative environment. And I wanted to speak for a couple of minutes about the concept of creativity, as well as the concept of environment. And we will then jump into some rich sharing and hopefully some great dialogue and Q&A with you all about Simpli5. So just bear with me while I get some table stakes out on the board here in terms of the types of environments that I've worked in. I also wanted to say that, you know, this platform and tool is something that I've been using in the last 2 roles that I had. So we use it extensively at IDEO, which is, as many of you may know, in case you don't, it's a human-centered design consultancy that really helped to put design thinking on the map over the past 40 years. And at IDEO, we used it with teams, with clients. I'll speak more about that later on. But I'm also starting to use it now in a much bigger organization where the culture is still very innovative and creative, but people are coming from a much more scientific-based mindset. So to get us grounded in creativity, I wanted to pull this up, and this is a definition by Teresa Amabile, who many of you may know, a longtime Harvard Business School professor and author of The Progress Principle, which is a fantastic book if you haven't read it. And in some of her early work, she defined creativity as the following. It is defined as the production of novel, useful ideas or problem solutions. It refers to both the process of idea generation or problem solving and the actual idea or solution. And what I really like about this definition is that it both speaks to the generation of new ideas, new concepts to the world, but also ones that are useful and applicable, right? They're not just new and crazy in their own right. And secondly, it also gives us a rich space to think about problem solving, to think about things that we need to do in the world for things to be viable and to exist and to be practical, which I believe is an underexplored side of the creativity coin. The second point that I wanted to underscore, and this is something that I actually felt as a child growing up in small town Ireland. Anybody that knows me knows that I will describe my upbringing as a low resource but high love and high energy environment, where there's a lot of creativity around us, even though we were, Ireland was still growing a lot and evolving in the late 1970s and early 80s. And when I went to work at IDEO, Tom Kelly, who's one of the two brothers who's a founder of IDEO, produced this book called Creative Confidence. And this is actually a great primer in terms of human beings and creativity, if you're interested in that. And the point I wanted to underscore here is that creativity is in all of us, but some of us have more creative confidence than others, right? Many of us believe that we may identify this way. We may have been around a lot of creativity. We may have had it in our job title, but regardless, the Kelly brothers really fundamentally believe that creativity is something that is inside of all of us. And actually, some of our traditional education systems and work environments kick it out of us, or they cause us to not be as creative as we might be. So really just wanted to underscore this point that we believe that creativity can be unblocked, and that this is a valuable thing for society, for our organizations, and for our communities. So why does this matter? Why am I talking about creativity, and is this just something for the sake of itself versus something which has more far-reaching implications? The last quote I want to start with here is from former President Barack Obama, and this is a speech that he gave a number of years ago, which I thought really kind of hit the nail on the head. I'm going to pause for a moment and read this with you, because I believe that there's a really important insight and principle here for us to absorb. He says, "The first step in winning the future is encouraging innovation. None of us can predict with certainty what the next big industry will be or where the jobs will come from. 30 years ago, we couldn't know that something called the internet would lead to an economic revolution. What we can do, what America does better than anyone else, is spark the creativity and imagination of our people. We're the nation that put cars in driveways and computers in offices, the nation of Edison and the Wright brothers, of Google and Facebook. Innovation doesn't just change our lives, it's how we make our living." So this quote I'm reading to you, not just to talk about how America is amazing, although I have chosen as an immigrant to come and live and build my life here, but really this concept that it's how we make our living. It's so impossible for us to disentangle creativity and imagination from everything in the world around us. And I think President Obama hit this on the nail on the head with his story. Another thing to hit on, which many of the speakers have touched on today already, and it's in some fantastic analysis that LinkedIn, where Kevin Bishop works, has recently published. As recently as this year, it was the #1 on their list, is this concept of creativity as being consistently one of the top 3, and indeed most of the time the top #1 skill for the future, in terms of both what employers are looking for and what education and development systems are trying to turn their energy toward creating in our young people. And the last point on creativity, and then we'll switch gears, is, creativity really doesn't just mean creative work product or entertainment, right? We're not just talking about novels and art and music and movies. We're actually talking about how things work and everything in the world around us. And I think this has been brought to life by an old quote from Steve Jobs, perhaps better than anybody. When Steve was working on the MacBooks and the Apple computers, thinking about how he might integrate end-to-end the software and hardware, he said this. He said, basically, design is not just what it looks like and feels like. Design is how it works. So this is really speaking to the broad-based potential of design and creativity to touch everything in our lives. So the last part of my introduction is going to talk about environment. And I think sometimes when we think about work environment, our head goes to 2 places. First of all, historically, it went to the physical spaces we work in, right? So I'm taking this call from the office today, but over the past couple of years, of course, many of us have been living from home. And we've learned over time that physical space can play a tremendous role in encouraging creativity in people. One of my old colleagues, an incredible person who I learned a lot from, called Chris Flink at IDEO, coined a famous phrase, which is space is the body language of an organization, right? And when we see photos of Google and Pixar and Apple and Tesla, we see that the physical environment is dialed in to support creativity and support a certain type of energy among the employee base. The point that I would underscore about environment today is that the way that we use our digital systems and tools, and Kevin actually hit on this in one of the breakouts before from LinkedIn, the way that we think about the apps we're using, whether it's Miro, whether it's Slack, whether it's Zoom, and also the artifacts through which we solve problems and run our organizations, those are also a very critical part of the environment. And I'm mentioning this because in a moment, we're going to talk a lot about psychological safety and its role in supporting dynamic energy. And if any of you know the work of Edgar Schein, he has a fantastic graphic of an iceberg where he talks about the way that the different artifacts and tools that we use support the behavior in an environment. So what I want us to take from this is that we actually can't directly control the environment for creativity as leaders. We can create the conditions for creativity. We can stoke it, nudge it, correct it, adjust it, but we actually can't wave a magic wand and tell people how they should behave. And this is particularly important when it comes to trust and psychological safety and some of these conditions and factors that have proven so important in fostering modern work. So the true line to today in the 5 dynamics system, I really want to just say that I believe in this tool. Of all the tools that I've used during my lifetime, I think it is the single most powerful tool that unleashes the capacity of teams. And specifically, it unleashes the capacity of teams beyond those who self-identify or are seen by others as naturally creative. So as far as I'm concerned, this is the only system that I've seen that can truly create a level playing field where we're able to tap into the capacities of everybody to be creative, not just those that identify with a certain energy type or a certain way of being. So why does this matter? The 2 points I would say here is that, at a fundamental level, it's simply the best tool because it follows the natural cycle of work that needs to get done. So if you think about the way that we work through the project completion cycle, it's not doing anything for itself as one end. It's actually looking holistically at the big picture of things that we need to see. And of course, the 5th dynamic is integrating how it all fits together. And having worked both at a creative consultancy, doing a little bit of teaching in the innovation theory space, and now working at a 100,000 person organization, for my money, it's one of the most appropriate platforms that is flexible and that can reflect the nature of work, regardless of whether you work in, research and prototyping, if you're in a heavy technical field, or if you're in finance or admin. This really is an umbrella. It's a broad church under which everybody can see themselves. The second point, which I really think is such a privilege and honor to get to talk about, and Karen started the day by talking about employee engagement and how it's been at one of the lowest levels for decades and decades. The system also for creative teams empowers everybody to be their best natural self. And I think this point can't be underscored enough, which is that when we are our best selves, when we feel comfortable, when we feel in flow, we are essentially a renewable resource, right? We've all had those days when we go home to our spouse or children or family. We talk about how the day flew by. Maybe we hit a roadblock. Maybe we did something else. But for the most part, we felt like we had a pretty good day. We felt like we were doing the right work. We felt like we were activated. Maybe we were in service of a goal for a customer or a patient or some collaborator out in the world. And I think that having come through the pandemic and thought a lot about this and done a lot of work in the future of workspace, this point in and of itself is a very strong argument for using this tool and system, because the way that we feel and the way that we can impact engagement by having people do the right work and the work that comes naturally to them in an inclusive way is really one of the single biggest things that I've seen move the needle. So diving a little bit more deeply into the creative process and talking about ways that I've used 5 dynamics and seen it applied in my teams and with my colleagues and collaborators, it really, really helps us because it also helps us get at something really key and fundamental in most creative processes, which is the fact that there can often be tension and pressure, that there are gaps that we have to overcome. We are dependent on people moving through a process very quickly. And so this on a human level can often lead to tension or friction, some of which people would argue is natural in that process, but which many of us know that if it's not kept in check or supported appropriately, can actually lead to negative externalities, psychological pressure, etc. And so I won't go into detail about this, but I thought it was a fun thing to look at when we sort of compare some of the really popular models of whether we call it human-centered design, design thinking, or sort of agile customer development processes. These are some of the models that are being widely used today. In the middle of the screen, we have the Stanford D-School process, which is very similar to the process that a company like IDEO would use. We also have the Double Diamond from the British Design Council, which talks about this cycle of explore and develop. And then we have other versions of this that go through various processes. The thing that I'd like you to take from this is that all of these processes, move forward in a cycle, and many of them have different dimensions in terms of going from concrete to abstract, converging and diverging. And anyone who's been around this kind of work knows that that's one of the power moves, right? When you sort of master, am I going up, am I going down, and how am I getting people to follow me willingly and move through the cycle? So coming back to the point about tension and creativity and why this matters, one of the biggest lessons that I learned as a young designer when I went to work at IDEO after business school is that moving through this cycle of work and doing it sort of on time, on budget, and with everybody sort of respecting and honoring each other, it doesn't always happen, right? You're often told in the early years of working at a place like a design consultancy, follow the process, trust in your leader, and it can be very emotionally grueling and frustrating. And so one of the things that I really picked up on and that many of my mentors helped me see is this concept that great creative teams can move through this tension and pressure by a couple of moves, right? The first one is depersonalizing critique. And a really good example of this is an early interaction I saw one time in a project space where someone was, we were falling behind on our deadline, someone was getting very frustrated, and someone ran ahead and did a whole piece of work. And then one of the sponsors came into the room and you could sort of see smoke coming out of their ears, and they were trying to give feedback on something. But they took a breath, right? They knew the famous line about, between stimulus and response, that's growth, right? They took a breath, and rather than saying, I hate this font, why are you doing this? Like, this is crazy, we have to redo this work. They took a moment and said, I'd love to understand what's going on with this typeface. And then, they listened, and then they said it was inappropriate. And then they said, I want to be clear. I'm very happy with you. I appreciate your effort. I just want, I don't, basically the phrase they said was, I don't hate you. I just hate the choice of this font in this moment, right? And they were able to de-escalate and depersonalize it and sort of have a more constructive dialogue about where they went from there. And so some of these ideas like curiosity, appreciative inquiry are key things that we use in the project room to move through some of these tension and pressure moments in creative work. And if you look at the picture on the screen here, I had a chance to work with Molly of Liz and Molly fame, which if you don't know their Hard Feelings book, it's an incredible resource. This is sort of a picture that hits this on the head, right? Where unhealthy conflict would say, between you and me, there's something going on that we have to address, and what is our relationship to that thing? But a more healthy conflict might say, actually, what if I assume good intent and you and me are together and we can come together to try and surmount this barrier or surmount this problem that we're facing. So I'm going to switch gears now into the second half of the conversation and talk about how we teamed at IDEO using 5 dynamics. And so 5 dynamics was the first time I used this was at the design consultancy, like I mentioned. Just for your kind of context and awareness, my career prior to that had been at Google and Bloomberg, both very creative environments, although we didn't really have these types of tools. There was a lot of Myers-Briggs and Energy Circle and all that kind of stuff floating around. And one of the things that I personally disliked about that was that it was so personality driven, that it felt like it was so deterministic and about putting people in boxes. Yes, everybody got something from every tool, but they could take you to baseball or opera and they could ask you if you liked it or hated it. And I feel like that was sort of the level of insight that we got from some of the tools. But 5 Dynamics was fundamentally different from the get-go. And I would say that the true power of the tool and system came when we had it at an enterprise level, where literally everybody at the company and even every intern and client and collaborator could be invited onto it, so that it just became rhythm of our DNA in terms of how we were using it day in, day out. The 3 use cases that I found the most powerful, and I'll give a short story for each one. The first one is creating balanced teams. The second one is boosting certain outcomes. And the third is what I would call shoring up gaps. Like I said, we use the tool a lot. I feel like at some point it was just open on my browser for years at a time. We teamed with our core communities. We also were able to invite clients. For a while, I was working at a venture fund with a number of startup founders in the crypto space. We used it across the board with nonprofits, activists, everybody from the CEO right down to interns. And I would say that I especially found it really powerful when we used it with what I would call interdisciplinary experts. So as many of you know, in the design world, this idea of unlocking the capacity and insight of many different kinds of people is really key. And so at IDEO Palo Alto, when I worked there, we would regularly have doctors, surgeons, aeronautical engineers, all kinds of people either working with us as full-time employees or on a 1 to 2 year rotation, where they were coming in to touch projects with their specific expertise. And the tool was particularly excellent at helping us understand the way that we could tap into these experts, particularly where they had maybe a little bit less or were still learning a more formal design process. So the first way that we used it was creating and launching balanced teams. So we would, of course, use it when a team was kicking off. We would use it to have the team look at their profile, talk about some of what they'd learned about themselves, use watch outs and risks. So we have a system that we call the flight system at IDEO, which was basically the launch, mid-flight, mid-cycle, and then the wind down process for programs. And to this day, it remains one of the most effective employee talent systems that I've seen anywhere in the world. So we would often use it during that process. And so you can imagine what that looks like, right? The team is looking at the spider graph. We're looking at different patterns of the energy profile. We would also sometimes use it though preemptively before we built a team to start to see this scatter plot of how is the core team and how is the extended team looking, and might there be something to watch out or to think about in terms of how we might actually form and build the team. And as you can imagine, that was tremendously valuable to be able to use that not as a substitute for a real human conversation, but as a way to maybe come up with some prompts that you might talk to people about individually. The word that I want to underscore here, though, is launch balanced teams, because many of you perhaps know the work of Hackman, I believe a sociologist from the 1950s or 60s. And there's this incredible stat about how a very big fraction, I think it's about a third of the success of any team comes from literally how they launch and how they kick off, right? Those first early conversations in terms of how they treat each other, how they get in the room together. And if you're not familiar with this work, I would give a big shout out to Remote Work Revolution by Sadal Neely at Harvard Business School. Many of you may have came across Sadal during the pandemic. She's been on the news. You know, she's the kind of author. My parents are texting me bits of stuff about her. She's kind of all over the place in a great way. And in her book, Remote Work Revolution, she actually goes into the canon of what we call launch meetings and kickoff meetings and talks about the way that you can set teams up for success. And so the 5 Dynamics system is really an incredible way. It's almost like a launch meeting in a box, right? You need pretty minimal infrastructure around the system to have a fantastic launch meeting. The team can then go into sort of setting their own agreements and talking about how they want to work with each other. And they can also look ahead to the project cycle, which I'll talk about in a minute, in terms of creating their own awareness and calibrating, you know, where things might be easy and where they might get more tough. The second point I want to underscore is what I would call boosting certain outcomes. And this is a phrase that kind of came up accidentally years ago. I was talking about thought partners, and this phrase torque partners came out. And really the concept here is, if you think about a gear shift on a bike, right? And the way that we might be cycling at a certain level, and it's kind of really hard work, and we're having to do a lot of cycles to get the bike to move. And then we might be able to fundamentally switch gears, right? And we get an unbelievable amount of torque or leverage from the bike itself. And that same amount of work might really help propel us forward and be much more intentional with our energy. And the concept here that I experienced both with myself and with others is that essentially at certain times for a defined moment in a project, and I'm going to show some visuals in a moment in the final part of the presentation, you might need to do something like, you might be trying to get a lot of ideas on the table. You might be trying to get more blue sky or crazy ideas and think in a really unconstrained way, and actually grabbing a few people that have more explore energy in that moment. You might be able to do something in an hour or 2 hours or a one-day workshop that could fundamentally save you 100 hours, could save you tens, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars, if you think really carefully about what it is that you need and what is the right appropriate way to bring it in. And so we definitely experienced this at IDEO, and I'm seeing it now in my new environment. There are combinations of people and teams that can really help you shore up certain outcomes in the right moment, of course, assuming that we're being inclusive and thinking about how to have a balanced team. There's also moments where you may specifically, very intentionally decide to move for torque. And torque can come from, of course, people with the same profile, giving us, you know, more of that energy. It can also come from what I call the piano chord, which is combinations of things that are kind of unusual, maybe not that obvious, that can also propel you forward very quickly. And in the very last part of the conversation, as I mentioned, I'm going to go through a couple of examples of these. And the last one is just quite obvious, really, but just to spell it out, I think the other way that the tool has proven really, really invaluable is shoring up gaps or blind spots, right? Looking whether it's at a level of 1 or 2 people together or a couple of people, what are we missing? What could we find? And how can we really design for that in the moment? You know, are we going to have a gap or a loss the whole way through the program, or at a certain time, are we going to have to fix something or boost something? And so this is myself and a former C-level colleague. We could see that we had a certain base condition, and then you added somebody else in, and it actually changed the pattern quite considerably. And so in this case, we were going to have a lot of fun with Explore together, but man, were we going to be kind of much better at Excite, and maybe a bit better in the execute space by buddying up. The last comment in this one is that in the creative world, you often have teams of people. So at IDEO, we call them guides, but essentially teams that were sort of like extended team members. They might be fully associated with a project for a long period of time, or they might just be people that could parachute and come in and help when they were needed. And Five Dynamics is particularly helpful for identifying people, regardless of level in the organization. If you need a boost, if you need to sort of fix something or repair something, what do you have? And back to my earlier comment about renewable resource, because this is energy is something that's essentially default to many people, it's their natural state of being. People actually love being pulled in, right? You might have one group of people who are maybe stressed, stretched out, and tired, and you might have somebody else who loves, doing a project management plan, or they love storytelling a pitch, they love exciting people, and God, you can prep them for 5 minutes and they'll go out and excite the world. And one of the things that I really appreciated about my time at IDEO is that they did a super good job of what they called guides, which were people that would come in and help a project team, or could be just available sort of throughout the organization to help, that could bring their natural energy and capacities to make any project better. Okay, so we're almost at the last part, and well, we are at the last part, and then we're going to take a little bit of a pause and hopefully get into some great dialogue with you guys. I really want to hear questions, provocations, pushback. I'm also here to learn today. But what I thought I would do in the final section is pull together a graphic of a traditional design process, and you'll see it in a moment. And I wanted to talk about maybe some provocations or ideas beyond the obvious, right? What are some things that I've seen or noticed in the context of a design journey? And I just wanted to put them out there in terms of thinking about how Five Dynamics has been showing up for me over the past couple of years and how it might help us all doing this type of work. So in the middle here, we have the design graphic, which we're going to use. So this picture will be the same for the next couple of slides. And this is similar to the graphics that I showed a few minutes ago. It's essentially talking about a program where we start with a central question and we run through 3 broad cycles, probably getting inspired and learning, ideating and coming up with new concepts, and then designing or creating a response that might live into the world. And so that's essentially the flow of this diagram. You could imagine that this could run, it could be as short as what we would call a design charrette, which might be just a couple of days of working together, in a shared space or mind. It could be weeks long, it could be months long, it could even be sort of like a program that could extend for several quarters or years, tackling a big question. So that's the core graphic in the middle to align us. And really the first part I wanted to underscore is that this isn't just about getting going and researching and learning and designing. There's actually a lot that you can do before the program even starts in terms of asking the right question, right? I would say this is sort of forming the right design brief, figuring out what we know already in the world and what we don't. And I think this is one of the things in my lifetime that has changed the most fundamentally since the internet has come along and since everything has become hyper-connected and so many things have been democratized knowledge-wise and IP-wise. Asking the right question and figuring out what is it that we now need to work on if we're inherently trying to do something new. What of the previous fact base in the world do we want to call upon and not want to reinvent the wheel on, right? We want to take certain things as an assumption versus the things where we do want fresh mind, we do want beginner's mind, and we do want to actually get into a creative generative space. So at the beginning of a project, people traditionally would associate this with the explore energy, bringing a lot there, but I actually think that the examine energy is also super critical, working in an iterative loop with explore to really figure out, are we launching off on the right design process and design brief? The other one real quick is just sort of throughout the whole cycle, right? Execute and excite, figuring out how to get people up and running and moving with momentum in an aligned way is something that obviously great teams know how to do, but which can be also kind of overlooked in the early stages of kicking off a program. So the next one I want to touch on briefly is probably one of the most obvious ones, and there's so much, in the literature and on YouTube about this. This is sort of what we would call the classic explore state of a creative process. So at this time, we're having a lot of probably brainstorming, generating ideas. we're going for quantity, we're looking for wild ideas, and we're typically not critiquing them or ranking or judging them. We're just sort of creating as much as we can. People with explore energy obviously have a ton of fun with that. The other two here that I want to talk about, though, are analogous inspiration. So this is a really, really key factor that I think more, intermediate to advanced design practitioners really know the value of, but maybe the general public who's only done a little bit of design thinking might not be as conversant in, which is essentially the act of looking at things from other industries and other contexts and figuring out where they're relevant and where they're not, and how we might take them forward. And so a good example of this that I can give you, there's a very famous one, which is about getting hospital teams to work together, where they're working on the interchange of switching over and stuff breaking. And there's a famous story about how they went out and spent time with a McLaren pit crew. So they said, okay, what's like this situation that we're dealing with, that we're learning about? Of course, we're going to go and talk to that hospital and those doctors and nurses and those employees, but what's a similar situation that we might transpose or translate an idea from? And if you haven't heard that story, it's a great one to go and find on the internet. So that act of analogous inspiration is really powerful in terms of thinking about things that people know how to do really well in the world that maybe they haven't applied to your industry or not. And then systems mapping is another one in terms of understanding the complexity of stakeholders and thinking about the full system in the broadest, most expansive way. These are all places where the explore energy will bring a lot and contribute a lot very quickly. This is just a personal piece of inspiration that I use, building on the idea of analogous inspiration. This is a famous story from the early days of IDEO, where a researcher was having a really hard time, actually, funnily enough, with a hospital crew, trying to explain to the executives what the experience was like of being in the hospital. And he didn't really feel like his ideas were being taken seriously. And so he had this kind of bright spark, unconventional idea that he would check in for an elective surgery. And I believe, as far as the folklore goes, he almost came pretty close to having the procedure done, and then he sort of outed himself. But he basically checked in with a handy cam, filmed everything going on, and was able to show them, the clattering pans and the noise and the squeaky LED light and the paint chipped on the ceiling, and it was able to bring this to life in a really visceral way for the hospital executives that made them much more mindful that, yes, they were investing in fancy machines and training, but really the lived experience of being in the hospital was falling down on an infrastructure level. And so this insight from this author, I think, hits it on the head, which is discovery consists of seeing what everybody else has seen and what nobody has thought. And so in this case, he was both seeing something differently, but then explaining it in a way where nobody else had thought of it quite like that. The next one I want to talk about real quick is synthesis. And so you see people sort of sloping down the curve here, where they've maybe had a ton of amazing ideas. They've hit this broad expanse of getting all the stuff out on the table. The explore people are probably still going. Everybody else is probably exhausted, but they're coming down the curve. And I think it's funny if you look at this curve, right? I mean, it can literally feel like you're going down a slope, because this is probably the most emotionally exhausting and taxing part of the process. And if you look at the photo at the top there, you see what looks like kind of a traditional project room, where they have all the sticky notes and insights up on the wall, and they've probably been running around doing all this incredible research. And now suddenly they have to package it up. They have to tell a story. They have to decide what ideas they move forward with, and they have to throw a bunch of stuff on the ground. And so a couple of the ways that I've seen the energy work up here, really importantly, is sort of the act of telling stories back to each other, right? So when you're doing design research or some of this early field learning in a creative process, many of the team will have been together probably quite a bit of the day, but people will always kind of have to split up, usually in pairs or trios, because they're going to try and cover more ground together separately. And so the act of telling the stories back to each other, and the act even of emceeing and curating how that dialogue flows, is also a tremendous place where excite energy can really move you forward. There's also something about pushing through a very taxing, demanding process with clarity together and with grace, right? So if you have a well-tuned, calibrated execute energy, that can also be really powerful here. And probably the biggest one in this, as you can sense, is sort of this seeing of the patterns and gaps and getting to those leap of faith insights. And connecting this to the torque partners a little while ago, this is one where I think the piano chord of explore and examine can be really powerful in terms of figuring out, what are we seeing, what are we sensing, but also grounding it a little bit more in that analytical rigor, which is so important in the creative environment. A couple more, and then we'll switch to Q&A. Ideation is really the heart of any creative process, and it's certainly the heart of this design process. And for me, this is actually one of the places where you can see if the whole system is going to really be fine or good versus truly excellent. And I think the best teams, when the energies are flowing and in harmony and balanced, is what I would say they've created an intellectual level playing field so that all team members can ideate fully, can vote fully and fairly. And I want to pause for a second here, because if you think about investing in an interdisciplinary team, you think about bringing designers, researchers, anthropologists, maybe you have doctors and surgeons, maybe you have somebody with more of a general background in the room. Really, you want those people because of all the different things that they bring. And it's so wasteful to invite people to the party and not tap into their natural energies. And so probably some of the best work that I've ever done or that I've been around happens when you have a business, a business model expert listening to an interaction designer who maybe picked up something about business, went to see a customer, had an empathy moment, and then asked a question or produced a prototype in a way that the business person probably wasn't quite able to, because they brought their deep experience in that sector, but the designer or somebody maybe saw it in a new way, and they were able to pick up the tool and create together. So this is a moment when the energies coming together can be really, really, truly profound. I would also say that this is really powerful when teams have gone through this journey together, and when we're also mindful of cognitive bias, and we're doing some of those practices to support psychological safety. Evaluation, right? So we've had this explore journey. We've maybe created prototypes. We're now maybe going to test, and this is really where examine and execute energies are going to be more dominant and come to the fore. And the rigor of knowing what to ask and how to measure is really, really, really important here, as well as the energy around making things happen in a way that's appropriate for what the customer feels comfortable with, what the user feels comfortable with, what the team can do. So the whole process of design research recruiting, testing, and running inclusive interviews is also one where you actually need a ton of firepower to make the trains run on time, and you really can't have people racing ahead, or you also don't want them, getting buried in Gantt charts. You need it to be human-centered, you need it to be appropriate and measured. And so this is one where the examine and execute energy really bring a lot into the program. And lastly, and then I'm going to tell one last story, creating a response to an opportunity in a way that is testable, verifiable, it should really be bringing all the energies together into a crescendo of thinking about how to integrate the best response going forward, which would be typically the prototype or the thing that we move through design into the world. The big idea here that I want to leave you with is this quote from Roger Martin. I'm going to tell two stories from Roger. Roger's the author of the Play to Win book. He's a new fantastic book out called A Way to Think. He's the founder of the Monitor Group. Many of you probably know him. He's an advisor to CEOs and board members. He turned around the Rotman School in Canada and really brought that into a very design forward, creativity forward, world-class institution. And I once heard Roger say this, and I thought it was so inspiring. He says, think of a prototype. It's a way to manufacture data that doesn't exist, right? Every prototype should be doing something, telling you something. If you do have good data from before and that's enough, maybe you don't need a prototype. But often when you're doing a prototype, it's because you don't know something or you need to learn something. And this photo down at the bottom here is one of my favorite stories that I heard from some of the leaders at IDEO, which was essentially when they were working on the physical form factor of the Apple mouse. So the concept of a mouse has an interesting story. It came through Stanford research. It's had a number of permutations and early development cases, but really when Steve Jobs came to the founder of IDEO, he wanted something that he could rub on his jeans. He wanted it to work on different surfaces, and that's basically where the patent for the rib cage, so they call it a mouse rib cage that the ball goes in, is from. Now, one of the things that the IDEO team, when they were getting ready to launch this product, were worried about was how would you clean the damn thing? So they started to notice, and I'm showing my age here. Maybe some of you had this before we had lasers on mice. We had these little core balls that popped out, and sometimes maybe some dust on your desk or something else would get stuck in it, and you used to have to open it and pull it out. And they essentially wanted to figure out, was this going to be a deal breaker, right? There was lots of good stuff happening with the mouse, but this was really stressful. And so one of the things that they did, and there's an amazing video clip of this that I don't have, unfortunately, but they essentially put the mouse prototype on a record player. They started at 33 RPM, going pretty fast. They cranked it up to 45. And then they went and got a bag of dust and junk from the kitchen and poured it on the record player. And they had this run for, 10, 20 minutes an hour. And they were basically trying to accelerate the process of the mouse getting dirty so that they could then clean the mouse, and then they could do it tomorrow, and then they could do it with different factors. And so this was a really key way to say, okay, these mice are going to get launched to the market. It might take years for us to learn, but we're here in a wood shop. We have prototyping materials. Let's just sort of get it going. And I think you can see here how you need the different energies. You need the examine energy, but you also need the explore and the execute and some of the other factors to figure out how can we do this quickly, how can we do it in an appropriate way, and how can we learn from as much as possible about it. So I'm going to wrap up. We'll give you guys these slides. I would just say that, you can see here that there are some pretty interesting, thoughtful ways that we can use the 5 Dynamics system to really kind of optimize, coach, and bring people not just on the design team, but in the organization to help the work be as strong as possible. You'll see here at the end that socialization, creating alignment, creating commitment, buy-in, all of these great factors that draw heavily on the excite energy are really, really important. And I would also say that explore, examine, like other ways that these things will show up in a great design team, where they're kind of understanding their role in the process and understanding what we need from them versus what we don't. So let me end with this quote that I heard last week, and then we'll go to Q&A. I was listening to a new episode of Dare to Lead by Brene Brown, who's, I'm sure many of you listen to her stuff. And I was really, really inspired by this conversation. If you haven't heard it yet, I'd recommend you check it out. There was one last week, and there's one that just came out yesterday, where Brene sits down with Adam Grant and Simon Sinek, so three of my favorite thinkers of modern times. And the point that I wanted to sort of end us with on here is that we're talking about what they see happening with leaders and teams, and it's a very organic conversation. But at one point, Simon pipes up, and it's sort of him that's quoted on the screen here, and he's trying to describe something that he sees most leaders grappling so much with. And if you read this with me, what he basically says is he finds it really ironic. We're out there talking and trying to describe teams, and so often that work is then applied, misapplied, or reappropriated into an individual. Right. And Brene goes, yeah, we're talking about Navy SEALs, and then we're talking about the sole Navy team. And he basically comes back and says, isn't it a tragedy? Our incentive systems in business reflect the overemphasizing of one value of rugged individualism. And he says, I think we're so over-indexed, and so far we've forgotten the value of service, the value that service requires in its very nature to be some sort of struggle or sacrifice, time, energy, all kinds of things. He basically says that the idea that you're going to give up something so that you or others can thrive, and the 3 or 4 of us can have joy in our work, that is the incredibly fulfilling and joyful thing for the person who gives and who serves. And so unrelated to this talk, I was traveling last Sunday, I heard this interview, and it just reminded me of both the power of this system, as well as what I've learned in my own work over the past 20 years, which is that it is really truly all about the team. I think teams are the unit of currency of the future. I think we do well and we thrive when we're making the most of teams. And I really hope that we can talk about how you guys are using the tool, what you're seeing with teams yourself, and what we can take forward from this fantastic day today. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. That was very inspiring and insightful. And I have a long reading list now. You mentioned so many great books. I'm going to go out and purchase those right away.
The holidays are coming.
That's right. Yeah, and so just a little housekeeping piece. Daniel, our producer, is going to open things up where you guys can unmute yourselves and ask questions. And I do have one question or comment that I noted as I was going through a design thinking experience, is that definitely it's about asking the right questions. But to me, having my 5D lens, it's also about asking the right people. And what I mean by that is, if you are a very high explorer and you have a kind of an out there creative concept, and then you go ask a bunch of people who are high and examine, they're going to shoot it down, and you're not going to get the feedback that you need, or vice versa. Maybe there's too much groupthink around, high explorer, and there's no reality in that solution. And so I just found that it's important to not only ask the right questions, but again, make sure you're getting a mix of energies of people when you're asking those questions.
That is such a profound insight. And let me just say that I think in how we recruit and prototype and test and then co-design with employees, I think that is a massively underutilized insight. So thank you for sharing that, Karen. I think that's a really profound one to think about.
Okay, I see Dr. Fiskus has her hand up here.
Oh, can you hear me okay? Thank you so much, Susan. I really appreciate your all your insights. I was really curious about how you have this process, this design thinking process, and you've really mapped out where different types of energies shine. how do you balance that with someone who might have an insight but feels like, oh, maybe all the excite work is over now, I'm going to let the examines take over, to continue that continuous engagement, understanding that, whatever part of the work really does need everybody engaged in it, if that makes sense, my question.
Yeah, for sure. It's a really amazing question, and I think the way I guess my response would be, I think the way that we rally and understand not just the goal of the project, right, but there's almost sort of mini goals or mini outcomes by stage, right, where we want to do the customer interviews, or we want to synthesize back, or we want to make a decision. I think what we didn't talk about today is just sort of how dynamically a project leader or a team might be referring to that process journey or diagram in a project space or in a virtual whiteboard, and the way that we really create commitment as a team to say, oh, I might really be attached to this idea, but actually we really only can do, three prototypes in the hospital, or we do need to have this ready by Monday, right? It's a little bit connected to the Simon Sinek quote. How do I, work in service of that outcome versus what I wanted to do myself? So that would be my first comment there. The second part, though, that I'll just quickly touch on is I do think that cognitive bias, and there's been a lot of work that I've looked at on organizational pathologies, different tendencies of different organizational types to have different blind spots and biases. That's also a super important one. And if you're interested in this, Micah Zenko, who works at the McChrystal Group, he's an author of a very famous book called Red Teams that talks about sort of red hat processes and counterintelligence. That's also one that I've looked a little bit at, but I think your question is spot on. We do need to be very mindful of it. And I think a good project leader, in my experience, just my own 2 cents, is they do rally the team around that mini outcome or goal along the stage. And people try to sort of support that outcome versus their own preference. Thanks for asking.
If I could, I would add to that. The one thing that we tell people is that it's not, if you have a lower explore energy, that you can't be the person who comes up with the most creative idea. Other people with other energies can be equally as creative. It's just a matter of saying, how long will they want to stay in this phase of the process?
Yes.
So it's more about how does your energy ebb and flow, not what are your capabilities or your competencies.
100%. And I would say then that also the way that we had coaches and guides and leaders that understood 5 dynamics, right, great people that I learned from, they're almost looking at it as a graphic equalizer relative to the process to make sure that it is working. And it's not about over-indexing on any one person or thing. It's actually about understanding the complement of energy and how the full picture comes together.
Other questions? Okay, Chris, I see you like to ask a question.
Yes, I work with UNC as well with Dr. Fiskus, and one of the things that we're trying to do is to marry both psychological safety along with 5 dynamics. So I was just wondering what your thoughts are on exactly how does one go about getting that idea of, feeling like I can bring my full self to work and being able to have those energies understood at the same time.
Absolutely. Karen may have good stories here too. I would say that for me, the single most powerful tool has been the agreement setting process. And I think so there's different words for it, but essentially when groups of people are signing up for something or exploring if they'll work together, they run through a cycle of talking about how they're going to work together, what are their boundaries, what are their preferences, and I hinted on this in the talk. Sometimes most of the time we would very explicitly use 5 dynamics in that process. The word I use now, which some of you may appreciate or not, it's basically the concept of context, right? What is the context around a person? And Francis Fry's book Unleashed talks a lot about hiring the person with their context, particularly based on whether it's demographic factors, race, whatever they're bringing to the world, seeing those things as an advantage rather than something to be managed or factored in. And so in the most powerful agreement setting situations, people voluntarily feel comfortable self-disclosing, what they need. It might be a certain arrangement for childcare or starting early or starting late or dialing in on certain days. The group will sort of dynamically co-create how they're going to work together. And they will also talk about how they're going to give each other feedback and how they're going to listen and learn from what is helping them be successful versus not. So it isn't easy. I would say it does require training and support and coaches, but for the most part, that's the way that I've seen the psychological safety stuff start. I mean, I would say sometimes it is very incremental baby steps. Unfortunately, the last thing I'll say is, the Google work was fantastic. It really put psychological safety on the map. If you look at Amy Edmondson's early research and some of the stuff in her books, there are a lot more tactics and skills that get pretty detailed that are not just about sort of knowing your employees' kids' names or being nice to them, right? I think we've sort of lost a lot of the meaning of psychological safety in what's been popularized in the media. And so I think looking at Amy's work is also a really interesting thing to do there in terms of some of the skills of bringing in all voices, reframing, et cetera. Karen, I'm sure you probably have a great one on this. Do you want to jump in?
Sure. Well, I was going to say that the first thing is totally outside of 5 Dynamics, but it's one of the things that we do internally, which is when we come into a meeting, we allow a couple of minutes at the beginning of the meeting for people to just show up and check in. We have human messiness, and we need to transition from the baby with the ear infection that's been screaming all night long, or whatever might be going on, where you can then just kind of be yourself, get that out of the way, and then you can move into that space. I think the other thing that I would think about is the fact that because we do show up with different energies, from different perspectives, we need to be intentional about the phases of projects. Susan did a great job of that, with showing kind of like, this is excite, execute, and this is explore, examine. And so when we show that there's a place for everyone and a time for everyone, again, not that you can't contribute in the other phases, but it makes you feel more empowered to be able to participate and to be recognized and appreciated. I mentioned it earlier today, that we've worshiped at the altar of execute for so long that we have left some of these other things off the boat. We don't necessarily give enough time to creation and to ideation. We don't necessarily give enough time. Most change projects, they fail because we don't spend enough time bringing people up to speed and getting their buy-in. And oftentimes we fail because we're not spending enough time in the examine phase. And so again, being intentional from a project management perspective about what the energies are, being intentional in meetings about what the energies are, that we're gonna, like, this is a brainstorming meeting, we're gonna spend 45 minutes in brainstorming. And so just labeling those things, calling those out, make people feel safer about being in that space for a certain amount of time.
Yeah. And if I can say one more word there, I think this is a very personal insight, but I think having project management that people respect and appreciate and understand, right? I in my early career, I definitely was around a lot of project managers, and I'm going to just generalize here, and I'm sorry, but like it was death by Gantt chart. It was sort of like they're coming around to fill in the spreadsheet, right? Nobody really knew why they were doing it. And obviously there are all kinds of flavors and personalities, so I'm not trying to demonize them, but I think actually having exceptional project management at every level in the organization and having them equipped and empowered with tools like 5 Dynamics, that alone can move the needle. I think it's an underrated, often discouraged craft and art, and it's as valuable as anything else. And that's also what 5 Dynamics helps us get at, is it helps us make that a real thing that people can respect and honor. So just thought of that when you were speaking a moment ago, Karen.
Okay. Do we have any other questions from the audience? Susan, earlier you mentioned about seeing what everyone is seeing. And I just wanted to add to that kind of that famous video of the people that are wearing black shirts and white shirts, and they're playing basketball and passing it back and forth. And what I learned from that is that it's not only about seeing what others have seen, but recognizing that you may be seeing something that no one else is seeing, and feeling empowered to be able to speak up about that. I know that was certainly an experience I had. It was in a group of women business leaders, and there were probably 15 of us, and they were saying, well, what did you see? And then no one said anything about the gorilla that walked through the room. And I was like, okay, but what about the gorilla? And everybody looked at me like I'd lost my mind. So, sometimes you see things that others don't as well. And again, just have that psychological safety and being able to step up and be able to share, that's important as well.
100%. And I built a Google form this morning. I'll let us go, but I built a form to get private intake from people quickly, even though they're all director and VP level people, because of the power of groupthink, right? Where I said, I privately need to know what you all think, and I'm going to screen share. And I think since the pandemic, in particular, with everything moving to video, this sort of extroverted talking out loud thing, there's a whole other side to this around the energy flow of what we traditionally think about introverted versus extroverted. I do think that cognitive bias and some of the stuff that we hit on in the Q&A is one of the next big frontiers for this work, and the chance to privately express an opinion, using conversational rounds, stuff like that. That's the practice that I'm working on now, because it's more important than ever. So maybe there's a future chat we can have about that.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Well, if we don't have any more questions, then I will let everyone go. But I want to thank Susan one more time for her time and her participation and presentation. It was very eye-opening. And thanks to all of you for sticking with us all day long. I know it's been a long time sitting in front of a computer and on a Zoom screen, but we really appreciate it. And there will be an opportunity to respond to a survey. So we can get your feedback on, what did you like? What would you like to see more of, less of, that sort of thing for next year? I'm hoping next year can be in person. I would really love to be able to have additional time to communicate and collaborate and share with one another. So we're looking towards 2023 and how that will roll out. And the different presentations today, we've tried to record. I think we have successfully recorded all of them. And so we will be sharing them with all of you as well. So thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of your day. And it was great to connect with you.
Thanks, everybody. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.